Walter Grant was rich, powerful, and ruthless. A real estate mogul who used lawsuits to silence anyone who spoke against him. So when a foreign student criticized his company for illegal evictions, he did what he always did. He dragged her into court, expecting an easy win. She was young, inexperienced, alone, or so he thought. Because the moment Lena Park stood up in court, Walter realized something terrifying. She wasn't just some clueless foreigner. She was the daughter of the judge presiding over the case. And she wasn't just fluent in English, she was fluent in the law. What started as a simple lawsuit quickly turned into Walter's worst nightmare. As Lena tore apart his case, exposed his corruption, and flipped the entire courtroom against him, Walter found himself on trial instead. And by the time he realized who he was really up against, it was too late. Stay tuned, because this is one of the most shocking legal takedowns you'll ever hear. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. Now let's get into it. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and spectators, all buzzing with anticipation. At the plaintiff's table, a wealthy businessman in his late 50s adjusted his custom-tailored suit, smirking with confidence. Walter Grant had built an empire in real estate, and he had no patience for outsiders meddling in his affairs. Beside him, his high-profile attorney, Stephen Daniels, checked his notes and whispered, "This should be over quickly, Mr. Grant. The defendant is unprepared." Walter chuckled, his gray eyes filled with amusement. "I knew she'd be clueless," he scoffed. "Probably doesn't even understand half the words in the legal documents." He glanced toward the defense table, where a young woman in her mid-20s sat, flipping through a thick binder of legal documents. Her dark hair was neatly pulled into a ponytail, and her modest beige suit looked completely out of place in a courtroom filled with high-priced attorneys and power suits. Walter smirked. She looked nervous, lost, overwhelmed, just as he had expected. The woman's name was Lena Park, a foreign exchange student who had recently moved to the U.S. from South Korea. Walter had filed a lawsuit against her after she had publicly criticized his real estate company for illegally evicting tenants. She had spoken at a community protest, calling his company corrupt, unethical, and discriminatory. And Walter? He had sued her for defamation. To him, this was just another business move, a way to scare off activists and silence anyone who dared speak against him. And now, as he watched Lena sit alone at the defense table, flipping through her notes with a slightly confused look on her face, Walter's smirk grew. "She's not even smart enough to bring a lawyer," he whispered to his attorney. Daniels nodded. "This will be over in minutes." Or so they thought. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Eleanor Park entered the courtroom, her stern expression commanding instant respect. Walter barely glanced at her. To him, she was just another judge. And it didn't matter who was presiding, because he was going to win anyway. The judge took her seat. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice sharp, "you are suing the defendant for defamation. Is that correct?" Walter stood confidently, straightening his suit. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Park turned to the defense table, her eyes locking onto Lena. "And you, Ms. Park, do you have representation?" Walter smirked. "Here it comes. She's going to say no. She's going to struggle to explain herself. She's going to embarrass herself in front of everyone." But then, Lena stood up, adjusting her blazer. Her voice was steady, polite, and clear. "Your Honor," she said, "I will be representing myself." The room fell silent. Judge Park raised an eyebrow. "Walter?" He laughed. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. But before he could say anything, Lena continued. "And before we begin," she said, her voice still calm, "I would like to make a motion for immediate dismissal." Walter's smirk vanished. Daniels frowned. "A motion for what?" Judge Park leaned forward. "On what grounds, Ms. Park?" Lena flipped through her binder, pulled out a document, and walked toward the bench with complete confidence. She placed it in front of the judge. Walter stared in disbelief. Where had the clueless girl gone? This wasn't the nervous and overwhelmed defendant he had expected. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Judge Park studied the document for a few moments. Then she looked up. "Ms. Park," she said, This is a copy of a tenant protection law from last year. Lena nodded. Yes, Your Honor. She turned to Walter Grant, her calm expression never changing. According to state law, Mr. Grant's company was already under legal investigation for multiple violations regarding wrongful evictions. Walter stiffened. Lena continued. This means that my statements regarding his company's unethical behavior were not defamation. She turned back to Judge Park. They were fact. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Walter felt his blood pressure spike. His lawyer, Daniels, looked shaken. This isn't right, Daniels muttered. She's just. Walter cut him off. I don't care what she's saying. Shut her down. Daniels quickly stood up, forcing a smile. Your Honor, Ms. Park is not a lawyer. She clearly doesn't understand. Judge Park held up a hand, silencing him. Actually, she said, her voice unreadable, Ms. Park's motion is legally valid. Daniel's face drained of color. Walter gritted his teeth. She can't do this, he whispered. But then, Lena turned her head slightly and finally looked Walter in the eye. And that's when he saw it. The confidence, the composure, the power. This was no clueless foreigner. This was someone who had been planning this all along. And then the worst possible thing happened. Judge Park sighed deeply. And then she smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Walter's stomach dropped. Why was the judge smiling? And then it hit him. The last name. Park. Judge Eleanor Park. Lena Park. Walter's breath caught in his throat. And before he could stop himself, he blurted out. Who are you? Lena's lips curled slightly. Then, with calm precision, she answered. I'm a judge's daughter. The courtroom fell completely silent. Walter's mind spun. He had mocked this woman. He had laughed at her, belittled her, and treated her like a fool. And all along, she had been the daughter of the very judge presiding over his case. And even worse, she wasn't just fluent in legal arguments. She was about to destroy him. Walter Grant had walked into the courtroom believing he had already won. Now, he was sitting frozen in his chair, staring at the young woman he had mocked just minutes ago. Lena Park. The same Lena Park who had just revealed herself to be the daughter of the judge. The same Lena Park who had just blindsided him with a legally sound motion. And worst of all, she was just getting started. Judge Eleanor Park leaned forward, lacing her fingers together. Her expression was neutral, but there was something behind her eyes, something Walter did not like. Ms. Park, she said, her voice calm, please continue. Walter's stomach twisted. Continue. He expected the judge to dismiss her immediately for being too personally involved. But instead, she was giving her the floor. This was bad. Really bad. Lena flipped through her binder and pulled out another document. Your Honor, she said, her voice smooth. Mr. Grant's entire case hinges on the argument that my statements about his company were defamatory. She paused, looking directly at the jury. But here's the problem with that. She lifted the document. This is a legal notice showing that Mr. Grant's company was already under official investigation for wrongful evictions before I ever made my statement. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Walter's face turned red. This isn't, he started. Lena ignored him. My so-called false accusations were actually public knowledge, Your Honor. She turned back to the judge. There's nothing defamatory about repeating a documented fact. Walter's attorney, Stephen Daniels, jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, he said quickly. The defendant is misleading the court. Judge Park raised an eyebrow. On what grounds? Daniels stammered. Well, Lena cut him off. Your Honor, I'd like to submit this document as evidence that my statement was based on fact. Judge Park nodded. Accepted. Daniels gritted his teeth. Walter turned to him, his eyes wild with anger. Fix this, he hissed under his breath. Daniels swallowed. I'm trying. But the jury was already leaning in Lena's direction, and Walter could feel it. He was losing control. Lena calmly walked back to the defense table, her binder still in her hands. She was supposed to be the underdog, a clueless foreigner, someone who didn't know how the system worked. But now, she was running this courtroom, and Walter Grant was scrambling to keep up. Daniels took a deep breath, forcing a smile as he turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he said smoothly, Ms. Park is intelligent, no doubt. But let's not lose sight of the real issue here. He gestured toward Walter. My client is a respected businessman. He has spent decades building his reputation. Daniels paced dramatically, lowering his voice for effect. But that reputation was tarnished by Ms. Park's reckless statements. Walter nodded, regaining his smugness. Yes, that's right. She had attacked his business. She had damaged his name. This was the angle they needed. Daniel stopped pacing and turned back to Lena. You may have legal knowledge, Ms. Park, he said, smirking, but that doesn't change the fact that my client has suffered real financial losses because of your words. Walter folded his arms, smirking. Checkmate. Or so he thought. Lena slowly closed her binder, setting it down on the table. Then she turned to Walter and smiled, the kind of smile that made his stomach sink. Mr. Grant, she said, her tone polite, you claim my words hurt your business, correct? Walter sat up straighter, regaining his confidence. Absolutely, he said. Because of you, we lost investors, deals, and credibility. Lena nodded. Interesting, she said. She reached in her binder one last time and pulled out a thick financial report. She set on the table. Because according to your company's own financial records, your profits actually increased in the months following my statement. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Walter's mouth fell open. Daniels turned pale. Judge Park glanced at the report. Then she turned to Walter. Well, Mr. Grant, she said. Walter felt sick. He had lied under oath. And now, he had been caught. The jury members whispered among themselves. Reporters scribbled furiously. Daniels ran a hand through his hair, realizing their case was falling apart. Walter? He was still staring at Lena, his mind racing. She had played him. She had let him believe she was clueless, only to destroy him when it mattered most. And now, it was over. Judge Park tapped her gavel. Order in the court, she said. She turned to Walter. You have provided no actual evidence of defamation, she stated. Walter opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing left to say. Judge Park turned to Lena. Ms. Park, you are cleared of all charges. Walter's stomach dropped. His case had been dismissed. Just like that. Walter Grant had walked into the courtroom expecting to crush an unprepared foreigner. Now he was the one sinking. His case had just been dismissed, his financial records had been used against him, and the jury was looking at him with disgust. But Walter Grant wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat easily. He still had money, influence, power, and if he couldn't win fairly, he would find another way. The moment Walter left the courtroom, he was furious. As reporters swarmed him outside the courthouse, he forced a grin and stepped up to the microphones. This was a miscarriage of justice, he announced, his voice full of fake outrage. The system has been rigged against me, and I was unfairly attacked by a woman with powerful connections. A reporter raised a hand. Mr. Grant, you claimed defamation, but the court found that Ms. Park's statements were based on fact. Do you have a response? Walter's smile faltered for half a second. Then he recovered. This isn't just about the truth, he said, pivoting his argument. It's about the dangers of outsiders coming in and manipulating our legal system. The reporters whispered among themselves. Walter was playing the long game now. If he couldn't win in court, he would win in public opinion. And Lena Park? She was about to become his next target. Within 24 hours, Lena's name was all over the news. Korean exchange, student uses judge mother's power to win court case. Did the system protect one of its own? The Park family scandal. Businessman targeted by foreign activist. Calls for investigation. Lena scrolled through the headlines, her hands tightening into fists. The comments were even worse. This is what happens when we let foreigners mess with our laws. She had an unfair advantage. No way she would have won without her mom as the judge. Walter Grant is the real victim here. Lena felt her chest tighten. Walter had lost in court, but now he was trying to win in the media, and people were starting to believe him. Lena sat across from her mother, Judge Eleanor Park, in their home. Her mother was reading the headlines, her face unreadable. After a moment, she sighed. This is exactly what I was afraid of, she said. Lena clenched her jaw. I didn't do anything wrong. Judge Park nodded. I know that, she said. But the court of public opinion is not about facts. It's about who controls the narrative. Lena looked at her. So what do I do? Judge Park folded her hands. "You have two choices," she said. "One, you stay silent and hope this blows over." Lena frowned. "And two," Judge Park's eyes hardened, "you fight back." Feeling emboldened by his media campaign, Walter Grant decided to push even harder. At a press conference, he made one final move. He looked into the cameras and said, "I'm calling for a formal review of Judge Eleanor Park for judicial bias." The crowd gasped. A reporter raised a hand. "Are you saying Judge Park made a corrupt ruling to protect her daughter?" Walter nodded gravely. "I'm saying we need an investigation." He smirked, because now he wasn't just attacking Lena. He was attacking her mother. And if he could get Judge Park removed from the bench, then he could prove that the system was rigged against him all along. At least, that's what he thought. What Walter didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because now, Lena wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her family. And Walter Grant had no idea what was coming next. Walter Grant had just crossed the line. He wasn't just attacking Lena Park anymore. He was going after her mother, the judge, the woman who had built her career on fairness and justice. Lena sat in her apartment, staring at the headlines on her screen. Judge Park under fire. Conflict of interest investigation demanded. Was the trial rigged? Businessman claims corruption in court. Daughter of a judge. Did she use family power to win? Lena's hands tightened into fists. She had spent her whole life earning everything on her own. Now, people were saying she had only won because of her last name. Walter wasn't just trying to save himself. He was trying to ruin her family. And she wasn't going to let that happen. Walter leaned back in his leather office chair, watching the news with a self-satisfied smirk. His plan was working perfectly. The media was eating up his accusations. He had turned a legal loss into a public battle. And if he could get Judge Park removed from the bench, then Lena's entire victory would be discredited. His phone rang. It was his attorney, Stephen Daniels. "Walter, I have to warn you." Walter cut him off. "Warn me about what?" he scoffed. "I'm finally winning." Daniel sighed. "Walter, you don't understand. She's fighting back." Walter froze. "What?" Daniels exhaled sharply. "She just announced a press conference." Walter sat up straight. "She's going public?" Daniels hesitated. "Yes, and I think you just picked a fight with the wrong person." Walter's grip tightened around his phone. "No," he muttered. "She wouldn't dare." But deep down, he was starting to feel uneasy. The next morning, the press gathered outside the courthouse. Lena Park stood at the podium, her posture straight, her face unreadable. She had been silent for too long. It was time to set the record straight. Flashes went off. Microphones were shoved toward her. Then she spoke. "I came to this country to learn, to grow, and to build a future based on hard work and integrity." She looked directly at the cameras. But some people don't believe in fairness. Some people believe that money and influence should allow them to bend the law. Walter watched from his office, his jaw clenching. Lena continued. "Walter Grant lost his case because he had no evidence. But instead of accepting the truth, he has resorted to lies, slander, and attacks on my family." Her voice hardened. "My mother has spent decades serving this country with honor and fairness." She lifted a document in her hands. "And if Walter Grant wants an investigation, then let's have one." The press exploded in gasps. Walter's face drained of color. She wasn't denying the investigation. She was challenging it. Within hours, the media coverage shifted. Reporters started questioning Walter's motives. If Grant had a solid case, why did he lose? Is this just a desperate attempt to avoid consequences? Lena Park calls for an investigation. Does Walter have something to hide? Walter gritted his teeth. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The public was starting to see through him. He had counted on Lena being weak, scared, or embarrassed. But instead, she had stood up to him. And now, he was the one running out of options. That afternoon, Judge Eleanor Park released an official statement. And it wasn't what Walter expected. She didn't deny the investigation. She didn't fight back with insults. She simply said, "The law applies to everyone, including me. If anyone wishes to question my integrity, I welcome the scrutiny. Because I have nothing to hide." Can Walter Grant say the same? The powerful simplicity of the statement sent shockwaves through the media. The public was turning against Walter faster than he could react. That night, Walter received a call from one of his biggest investors. "We're pulling out of our partnership," the man said bluntly. Walter shot up from his chair. "What? You can't be serious." The investor's voice was cold. "You went too far, Walter. This isn't a fight you can win." Click. The call ended. Walter stared at his phone. His business empire was built on connections. And now, those connections were vanishing. One by one, Walter Grant had spent his life building an empire. He controlled real estate deals, corporate partnerships, and political favors. He bought influence when necessary. He silenced critics with lawsuits. And he won. Always. But now, he was losing control. Fast. Walter paced his office, gripping his phone. Another business partner had just pulled out. That made 3 in a single day. His once loyal investors were cutting ties, afraid of being associated with a man accused of legal manipulation and racial discrimination. Walter called his attorney, Stephen Daniels. The moment Daniels picked up, Walter snapped. "This is getting out of control." Walter hissed. "Fix it." Daniels sighed heavily. "Walter, it's already too late. The public has turned against you." Walter's chest tightened. His entire empire was built on image. And now, that image was destroyed. The next morning, Walter stood in court for what was supposed to be his moment of victory. Instead, he was about to be humiliated in front of the entire city. Judge Eleanor Park entered the courtroom, her gaze sharp and unwavering. The moment she sat, she spoke directly to Walter. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice even, "this court finds that your lawsuit against Ms. Park was without merit and filed in bad faith." Walter's blood ran cold. Judge Park continued, "In light of your false accusations against this court's impartiality, I am officially recommending a formal investigation into your business practices." Walter's heart stopped. "An investigation?" Judge Park turned to Lena. "Ms. Park," she said, "do you wish to file a counter-lawsuit for damages?" Lena stood up slowly, her expression unreadable. Walter braced himself. This was it. This was where she would destroy him completely. But instead, she simply shook her head. "No, Your Honor," she said. "I don't need to." Walter blinked. "What?" Lena turned toward him. Her voice was calm, controlled, final. He already lost. Walter's hands curled into fists. Because the worst part? She was right. After the verdict, the fallout was immediate. His business partners pulled out completely. His board of directors forced him to resign. His public reputation was beyond saving. He had spent decades building his empire, and Lena Park had torn it down in a matter of weeks. Walter sat in his empty office, staring at the headlines. Walter Grant removed from his own company. Failed lawsuit leads to business collapse. From power to ruin. The businessman who picked the wrong fight. His phone buzzed. A message from his attorney. "We're officially out of options." Walter closed his eyes. He had lost, and there was no coming back. Meanwhile, across the city, Lena sat in a quiet cafe, sipping her coffee. David Cole, her friend and legal consultant, sat across from her, grinning. "You really took him down," he said. Lena shrugged. "He did it to himself." David chuckled. "True, but you made sure everyone saw it happen." Lena simply smiled, because Walter Grant had tried to silence her. Instead, she had exposed him for the fraud he was. And now, she could finally move forward. Walter Grant had spent years building a name that commanded respect. Now, his name was a joke. His business was gone. His influence was shattered. His reputation was destroyed beyond repair. And worst of all, the world had moved on without him. At first, the media hounded him, wanting interviews, quotes, or statements. Walter had tried to spin the story, claiming he was the real victim, but no one believed him. After a few weeks, the calls stopped coming. The reporters stopped caring, because new scandals had taken over the headlines. And Walter Grant, he had become yesterday's news. Walter tried to rebuild his empire, reaching out to old contacts. But every call ended the same way. "Sorry, Walter, we can't be associated with you. Your name is bad for business." It's over. No one wanted to partner with him. No one wanted to work with him. The people who had once begged for his attention now wouldn't even return his calls. Desperate, Walter filed a defamation lawsuit against multiple media outlets. He thought he could clear his name. Instead, the case was laughed out of court. The judge dismissed it immediately, stating that the negative press coverage was based on facts. Walter couldn't fight facts, and now he was running out of money, power, and options. While Walter was falling, Lena Park was rising. Her name had become synonymous with justice. She was offered internships at top law firms. She was invited to speak at legal panels. She became a symbol of standing up against corruption. And Walter? He had to watch it all from the sidelines, because no one cared about him anymore. One evening, Walter sat alone in a small diner, stirring his coffee. The once powerful businessman, now just another forgotten face in the city. He had spent his life controlling people, silencing critics, crushing opponents. But in the end, he had destroyed himself. The door chimed. Walter looked up. For the first time in months, he saw Lena Park. She walked in, her posture strong, her presence commanding. She ordered her coffee, then turned. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, Walter saw no anger in her gaze. No khatarith, just acceptance. She gave him a small nod. Then she turned and walked away. And just like that, she was gone. Walter sat there, staring into his coffee, realizing the truth. He wasn't powerful anymore. He wasn't feared anymore. He was just no one. Walter Grant had once been a giant in the business world. Now, he was nothing. His name, once respected, was now a cautionary tale. His influence, once untouchable, had vanished. And worst of all, no one remembered him. The news cycle had forgotten him. The business world had erased him. Even his old rivals no longer cared about him, because he wasn't worth their time. He had always believed that power lasted forever. But now he understood the truth. Power only lasts as long as people believe you have it. And Walter Grant had nothing left to believe in. Meanwhile, Lena Park had become a rising star in the legal world. She was offered positions at major firms. She became a guest speaker at legal summits. And her story was shared as an example of standing up to corruption. She had walked into that courtroom as just a student. Now, she was on her way to becoming one of the most respected legal minds of her generation. And the man who had tried to destroy her wasn't even part of the conversation anymore. In a last-ditch effort, Walter tried to start over. He reached out to former business contacts. No one responded. He attempted to launch a new company under a different name. It failed immediately. His reputation had been permanently tainted, and he realized something even worse. People weren't just avoiding him. They had completely forgotten about him. One evening, Walter sat in a dimly lit bar, staring at his drink. He overheard two young businessmen at the next table. Remember Walter Grant? One of them asked. The other frowned. Who? Walter's chest tightened. The first man chuckled. You know, that real estate guy. Got exposed in court by some student and lost everything. The second man laughed. All right. Man, that was years ago. They went back to their conversation. Walter sat there, his hands trembling. His name wasn't feared anymore. It wasn't respected anymore. It was forgotten. And in the end, that was a fate worse than losing money. Worse than losing power. Because he had spent his whole life trying to be remembered. And now, he was just another man in the background. Lena Park was preparing for her next case. Her career was thriving. Her reputation was growing. And Walter Grant didn't matter anymore. David Cole, her legal consultant, walked in her office. He smirked. Ever wonder what happened to him? Lena looked up from her notes. For a moment, she thought about it. Then she shook her head. No, she said simply. She had moved on. Because Walter Grant was nothing but a name in the past. And she had far more important things ahead of her.